Let's begin with a moment, an ordinary day in Colonial, Massachusetts. It's 1692.
The air is thick with the scent of burning firewood, horses shuffle slowly through muddy village roads, and townsfolk gather in churches more often than markets. Salem village is quiet, tightly woven together by religion, fear, and hierarchy. But that fragile peace is about to be shattered by something that starts small.
Very small. A cough. A scream. A seizure. In a dimly lit parsonage, two girls begin to twitch and shriek.
Betty Parris, the 9-year-old daughter of Reverend Samuel Parris, and her cousin Abigail Williams, only 11, are the first to show the so-called afflictions.
They scream. They contort.
They claim invisible forces are pinching and choking them. They bark like dogs and hide under tables. And nobody has any explanation.
Not the doctor. Not the reverend. Not the townspeople. Except one, a dark one. Witchcraft.
You see, colonial New England was already soaked in fear long before these girls made a sound.
Fear of outsiders. Fear of disease. Fear of Native American raids. And above all, fear of the devil.
To the Puritans, Satan was not a symbol or metaphor.
He was real. Active. Always scheming. And witches, his agents, were believed to walk among the God-fearing. So when the doctor finally declared that the girls were under an evil hand, it was as if he'd opened a dam. The community, already wound tight with superstition, snapped. If something unexplainable happened, it had to be the devil's work. That's just how they thought. And it didn't take long before the finger-pointing began. The first accused was a woman named Tituba. She was enslaved, likely of Arawak or African descent, brought to Salem from the West Indies. To the Puritans, her difference, her skin, her speech, her customs made her an easy target. She was called other. Dangerous. When pressed to confess, she didn't deny it. But not because she was guilty of witchcraft. No. Because she was terrified. Under threat and likely physical coercion, Tituba confessed. And not just to being a witch, but to seeing others too. She claimed witches flew through the night on poles, signed the Devil's Book, and plotted to tear down the Puritan church. This confession exploded like a firecracker in the minds of the people. If the devil had infiltrated the village, they had to root him out fast. And so began the great unraveling. More girls began to show symptoms. More names were offered. Sarah Good, a poor beggar woman who smoked a pipe and muttered to herself, became suspect number 2. Then came Sarah Osborne, who hadn't been to church in a while and had married a servant. In Salem, that was enough to warrant suspicion. The line between sin and crime blurred fast. Soon, people weren't just accusing those on the margins. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Families split. Entire reputations crumbled overnight. Anyone with land, grudges, or enemies became a potential witch. It wasn't about justice anymore, it was about fear. And fear has a way of spreading like wildfire. The colonial legal system wasn't built to handle hysteria. The court accepted spectral evidence, testimony that someone's spirit had appeared in a dream or vision to hurt another. Imagine that. You didn't need physical proof. If someone claimed they saw you in their nightmare attacking them, that was enough. That kind of logic might seem absurd now, but in 1692, it was the foundation of justice. By the end of spring, dozens had been accused. Jails overflowed. And the people of Salem found themselves spiraling into something they never imagined, a full-blown witch panic. But let's pause here for a moment. What caused this outbreak to escalate so quickly? Why did these accusations spread from 3 women to nearly 200 people? And why did the courts allow such flimsy evidence to send people to the gallows? To answer that, we have to understand Salem really understand it. It wasn't just one town. There was Salem Town and Salem Village. And those two places had very different identities. Salem Town was the wealthy, coastal, mercantile hub. People traded, traveled, and prospered. Salem Village was inland, poor, and agricultural. Tensions festered between them, between old ways and new money. That tension would be a fuel source for everything that came next. Then there was religion. The Puritan worldview was rigid. You were either godly or wicked. There was no middle ground. They believed in predestination, the idea that God had already chosen who would be saved and who would be damned. But no one knew for sure which group they were in. That uncertainty bred anxiety. And witchcraft. It gave people a target for that anxiety. Combine that with land disputes, class resentment, and the brutal hardship of colonial life, and you've got a powder keg. The afflicted girls were just the spark. Back in the courtroom, things took a chilling turn. Bridget Bishop, a tavern owner who dressed flamboyantly and spoke her mind, was one of the first to be tried. She didn't stand a chance. Witnesses claimed they saw her spirit tormenting others. She was hanged on June 10, 1692. After that, the gallows stayed busy. Every execution sent a message: the devil is among us and we are fighting him. But here's the twisted part: the more people were executed, the more convinced the community became that they were doing the right thing. The Puritans thought they were purging evil. But they were feeding it. That's how mass hysteria works. It doesn't stop with reason. It feeds on fear and grows with every scream, every accusation, every body buried. And yet, this is only the beginning. Because in part 2, we're going to explore how some of the most respected families in Salem were dragged into the chaos, how reputations were shattered and lives ruined, not just by superstition, but by politics, power, and personal vendettas. The Salem Witch Trials weren't just about witches. They were about people, flawed, frightened people making desperate decisions in desperate times. And the consequences would echo far beyond the gallows. By the time summer 1692 rolled around, Salem wasn't Salem anymore. It was something darker. Something almost unrecognizable. Fear had seeped into the soil. The sound of a name whispered in the wrong ear could mean prison or worse. But now, the accused weren't just beggars and outsiders. The noose was tightening around some of the most prominent citizens of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. One name stood out among the chaos: Rebecca Nurse. She was 71 years old. A deeply religious woman. A respected matriarch in Salem Village. If anyone had been considered above suspicion, it was her. But none of that mattered once she was accused. Why her? Some say it was envy. Others point to a long-standing land dispute between her family and the Putnams, one of the most powerful and vocal families in the village. And you'll hear their name a lot. The Putnams weren't just believers in witchcraft. They were some of the loudest accusers. When Rebecca was arrested, people gasped. Literally. Members of the congregation cried out in protest. Even the minister was shaken. But the court didn't care. The afflicted girls screamed her name. Claimed her specter tormented them at night. That she pinched them. Choked them. Sent her ghost to their homes. And in this strange new Salem, that was all it took. She was tried. She maintained her innocence, steadfast. But on June 29, the jury found her not guilty. Yes, you heard that right. For a moment, reason tried to break through the madness. But only for a moment. The courtroom erupted in protests. The afflicted girls fell into fits. One even claimed a ghost whispered to her that Rebecca Nurse was guilty. The judges, who had already been criticized for being too lenient, told the jury to reconsider. And they did. They changed their verdict. From not guilty to guilty. Just like that. Rebecca Nurse was hanged on July 19. Her story marked a terrifying shift. If someone like her, elderly, pious, beloved, could hang, then no one was safe. That's when the trials turned truly ruthless. Names flew like daggers. Martha Corey, wife of Giles Corey, was next. She'd been skeptical of the trials, openly so. That made her a target. Speaking against the accusers was seen as siding with the devil. Martha ended up in jail. But her husband's story was even more chilling. Giles Corey wasn't young. He was in his 80s. But when he refused to enter a plea in court, neither guilty nor not guilty, the judges decided to break him. Literally. They subjected him to pressing. It's exactly what it sounds like. They placed a wooden board on his chest and stacked heavy stones on it, one by one. Over 2 days, they crushed the life out of him. His final words? More weight. Giles Corey became a legend. A silent protest against injustice in the loudest, most painful way possible. But let's pause and ask something here. How did this happen? How did judges, ministers, and even ordinary villagers who believed in God and justice become agents of such cruelty? A lot of it comes down to power. Let's talk about the court, the infamous court of Oyer and Terminer. This special tribunal was set up specifically to handle the witchcraft cases. And it operated under a different set of rules. Chief Justice William Stoughton was a hardliner. He had no legal training. But he had one thing that mattered more: absolute belief that he was on a divine mission. He saw witches not as defendants, but as enemies of God. And he treated them as such. Under his leadership, the court relied heavily on spectral evidence. Again, claims that someone's ghost or shape had committed harm. No physical proof. No eyewitnesses. Just feelings. Visions. Dreams. It was a system built to convict. And it did. Fast. By late summer, the jail in Salem was overflowing. Prisoners were held in freezing cells, chained to the walls. Some died before ever seeing trial. Pregnant women were arrested. Children, too. Yes, children. Take Dorothy Good, for example. She was 4 years old. Her mother, Sarah Good, had already been accused. When the magistrates questioned little Dorothy, they claimed she admitted to having a pet snake that talked to her. That was enough. They threw her in jail. She stayed there for 9 months. By the time she got out, her mind was shattered. This wasn't just a legal disaster. It was a moral collapse. And yet, many in the colony still believed they were doing God's work. They thought they were at war with invisible forces. Ministers preached from the pulpit that the devil was winning. That witches were among them. That this was a test of faith. But not everyone agreed. One minister, Reverend Increase Mather, began to speak out. He warned that it were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person be condemned. His words were bold. Dangerous. But they planted seeds of doubt. At the same time, stories started to spread. That some accusations were based on revenge. That people used the trials to steal land. That old grudges were being settled in courtrooms under the cover of righteousness. And slowly, very slowly, the spell began to break. In the coming parts, we'll see exactly how public opinion shifted. How the governor stepped in. How the court was dissolved. And how colonial America would forever carry the shame of what happened in Salem. But for now, as we close part 2, remember this. Witch hunts aren't always about witches. They're about fear. About control. About what happens when truth is bent to serve power. The Salem Witch Trials didn't just destroy lives, they revealed how fragile justice can be when it's poisoned by panic. As the summer of 1692 deepened, Salem was gripped by a fever unlike anything the colony had ever known. The hysteria that began with a handful of afflicted girls had now exploded into a widespread frenzy that engulfed nearly the entire community. Accusations were flying left and right, and the once tight-knit village was now torn apart by suspicion and paranoia. One of the most alarming developments was the involvement of some of the wealthiest and most influential families in the region. The Putnams, especially Thomas Putnam and his wife Anne, were at the heart of much of the accusation network. The Putnams' motivations were complex, a mixture of genuine belief in witchcraft and deep-seated resentment over land disputes and local politics. Thomas Putnam, in particular, is often viewed by historians as having exploited the crisis to expand his family's property holdings by encouraging accusations against his neighbors. The court proceedings became a stage for personal vendettas masked as piety. Neighbors accused neighbors, sometimes over petty quarrels or old grudges. The trials were less about finding truth and more about settling scores. For example, Martha Corey was accused despite her husband Giles Corey's open skepticism about the trials. This tension between belief and skepticism created an atmosphere where any dissent was dangerous. Public executions became grim spectacles that attracted crowds from miles around. The hanging of Bridget Bishop was only the beginning. Soon, more were sentenced to death, including Rebecca Nurse and Sarah Good. The executions were meant to serve as warnings to others, but they also heightened fear. People saw the noose as a very real possibility hanging over their own heads. One chilling aspect of the trials was the reliance on spectral evidence. This type of evidence meant that the afflicted girls could claim to see the spirit or shape of the accused harming them even if the accused person was elsewhere at the time. This made defending oneself almost impossible. How could you prove your spirit wasn't tormenting someone when you were sitting safely in jail? Many tried to fight back by bringing in character witnesses or praying publicly, but the hysteria often drowned out reason. Judges were predisposed to believe the worst. The legal framework was skewed, with the court of Oyer and Terminer operating with little regard for what we would now consider basic fairness. Amidst this chaos, other tragedies unfolded. Innocent people were imprisoned for months in squalid, overcrowded jails. Some, like Sarah Osborne, died before their trials even concluded. Families were torn apart. Children lost parents. The social fabric of Salem was unraveling. There was also growing concern about the trials beyond Salem. Prominent figures in Boston and elsewhere began questioning the validity of the accusations and the legal methods being used. Reverend Increase Mather's cautionary stance gained more supporters as evidence mounted that the trials were spiraling out of control. In this part of history, it becomes clear that the Salem Witch Trials were not just about supernatural fears but were also deeply entangled with human nature, greed, envy, fear, and power struggles. The events showed how easily reason can be overshadowed by panic and how vulnerable communities can become when fear reigns supreme. As we prepare to move forward, the stakes are about to get higher. The trials will reach new heights of cruelty and absurdity. The hysteria will consume even more innocent lives before the tide finally begins to turn. Ready for Part 4? By the late summer of 1692, the Salem Witch Trials had spiraled far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The original accusations, which had started with a few girls in Reverend Parris's household, had mushroomed into a full-blown witch hunt that gripped the entire Massachusetts Bay Colony. The court was now holding dozens of trials, and the list of the accused was growing by the day. One of the most shocking elements during this period was how the hysteria began to infiltrate even the highest levels of Salem's society. Wealthy merchants, respected ministers, and landowning farmers were no longer safe from suspicion. The social order, which had been rigid and well-established, was crumbling under the weight of fear and suspicion. One tragic case was that of George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem Village who had moved away but was still called back to stand trial. Known for his eloquence and strong leadership, Burroughs was accused of being the ringleader of the witches. The prosecution alleged that he had cursed the town and caused deaths through his supposed pact with the devil. Despite his protests of innocence and his recitation of the Lord's Prayer in court, prayer witches were said to be unable to say he was convicted and hanged. This case highlighted a terrifying truth: even the most respected and educated were not immune to the witch hunt. If a former minister could be accused and executed, then no one was truly safe. Meanwhile, the trials became theatrical events. The afflicted girls, now numbering more than a dozen, put on elaborate performances of fits, screams, and convulsions. Their accusations became more dramatic, naming people far beyond Salem Village, including individuals from nearby towns. Their testimonies were accepted as gospel, despite the obvious theatricality. Public opinion started to fracture. Some townsfolk remained convinced that the trials were necessary to protect the colony from evil. Others grew increasingly uneasy about the growing number of accusations and executions. Families were torn apart, and social trust eroded. In the midst of this, the colonial government itself began to respond. Governor William Phips, appointed by the English crown, started hearing complaints from citizens who were horrified by the trial's excesses. The economic and political stability of the colony was at risk. Phipps eventually dissolved the court of Oyer in Terminer in October 1692, halting the trials, but by then, more than 20 people had been executed, and many more languished in prison. The collapse of the court marked a turning point. New courts reopened cases, but spectral evidence was no longer admissible, and many accused were released or acquitted. The colony began to reckon with the nightmare it had lived through. But the scars remained. Families mourned lost loved ones. The community's reputation was forever tarnished. And the Salem Witch Trials became a chilling lesson about the dangers of fear, hysteria, and injustice. As we move into the next part, we'll examine how the trials finally came to an end, the role of key figures who spoke out against the madness, and the long-lasting impact on American law and culture. The aftermath of the Salem Witch Trials left the community shaken to its core. When the court of Oyer in Terminer was disbanded, many Salem residents hoped the nightmare was over. But healing would take years, decades, even, and the trial's legacy would cast a long shadow on colonial America. One of the key figures who helped bring the trials to a close was Governor William Phipps. After receiving mounting complaints from citizens, including influential ministers and politicians, he realized that the court's reliance on spectral evidence was deeply flawed. Acting on this, he ordered a new court to be formed that did not allow such evidence. The new court led to a number of acquittals and releases, but the damage was already done. Many of those accused had spent months, even years, in harsh prison conditions. Some had died while awaiting trial. The stigma of accusation, regardless of acquittal, haunted survivors and their families for life. Property disputes arose as lands once confiscated were returned or contested, further complicating the social fabric. The clergy also grappled with their role in the tragedy. Reverend Increase Mather, who had earlier cautioned against convicting on spectral evidence, became an advocate for reforming the justice system. He urged that it were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person be condemned. His words echoed across the colony and shaped future legal principles. The Salem trials also inspired introspection about the dangers of religious extremism and unchecked authority. For many, it was a painful lesson on how zealotry, fear, and political ambition could override justice and reason. In the decades that followed, Salem and the broader American colonies began to develop more rigorous legal protections. The principle of innocent until proven guilty gained traction, and evidentiary standards tightened to prevent such miscarriages of justice. Despite the darkness of the trials, the story also revealed the resilience of communities and individuals who refused to be defined by hysteria. Families rebuilt their lives. Communities healed slowly, remembering the fallen but determined to move forward. Today, the Salem Witch Trials stand as a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of what can happen when fear trumps reason, and when society allows suspicion and prejudice to guide justice. As we continue, the next part will explore some of the personal stories of those accused, their families, and the emotional toll the trials took on everyday people. Their voices are the heart of this tragedy and the reason why the Salem Witch Trials remain deeply relevant even today.